Thank you, Acting President. I'm very pleased to rise to speak on the Tobacco Amendment. Tobacco Retailer and Wholesaler Licensing Scheme Bill 2024. It's an important bill. It will introduce to Victoria important, long-awaited reforms to strengthen the system of tobacco control that exists here in this state. Victoria has been a world leader in tobacco control since the 1980s. I'll get to that a little bit later in my speech, but I think it is important to reflect on that at the top, that this is yet another example of Victoria taking the steps necessary to support public health and support those in the community who suffer harm from tobacco. Tobacco, of course, cigarettes have the distinction of being one of perhaps the only legally available product that when you use it exactly as the manufacturer intends, it's going to kill you. In fact, tobacco kills 2 out of 3 people who use cigarettes as they are intended to be used. And that is a damning indictment on them as a product, but also a reminder to us that beyond the contemporary and real controversies that exist with respect to tobacco stores, arson and related issues, that the core issue, I think, in relation to this bill is putting in place further measures to deal with the harm that comes because of tobacco consumption in our community. 18,000 Australians, slightly higher, are killed each year due to smoking. Around nearly 4,500 Victorians die every year from smoking-related injury. So that works out to be 85 people a week dying in Victoria because of tobacco-related disease and tobacco-related industry. And they're dying on average 10 years earlier than people who don't smoke. From cancer, from lung, throat, mouth, nose, voice box, pancreatic, liver, stomach, kidney. The lists of cancers go on and on. They die from heart disease, from cardiovascular disease. They die from stroke and emphysema. Because smoking of cigarettes is a particularly pernicious cocktail that we inhale into one of the most sensitive parts of our body, and that's our lungs. The cigarette is a vehicle for the transfer of toxins from a manufactured product to the insides of our body and into our bloodstream. And it's laced with addictive substances. So toxin and addiction is what cigarettes deliver. And it kills people. And it harms them. And if this legislation helps reduce that harm, it should be supported for no other reason than it should reduce the harm that comes from the consumption of these products. But it's not just the people who smoke cigarettes that are subject to the harms from cigarettes. It's others in the community as well. People who choose not to smoke face risk from smokers who do. And one of the great things that this state has been at the forefront of over the last 30 years of our efforts on tobacco control, and Mr Davis mentioned some of them in his contribution, is the restrictions and limitations that we've put in place to stop people suffering the harms from other people smoking. And that's been a really important feature of the action that this state, that this parliament has taken on a bipartisan basis on most occasions, I think on all occasions, that seeks to ensure that harm isn't spread to people who don't even choose to participate in the activity, who are exercising a choice not to be exposed to harm. And we have a duty, we have an obligation to protect those people as well, particularly from children raised in environments where there's smoking are more likely to suffer from respiratory diseases. Those lists go on. We have made, obviously, in the last 30 years since the passage of the Tobacco Control Act here in Victoria, through to the restrictions on advertising, the restrictions on advertising at points of sale, restrictions on places where people can consume cigarettes, restrictions on the ability to entice future users and get them hooked on a deadly cycle of addiction through the limitations on product placement in television, for example, the limitations on how packaging can be displayed, the false claims about smooth and light and easy and fresh that tobacco companies were using to cloud the reality of cigarettes being a deadly cocktail of toxins. Many respects, the same tactics that are being used today by the tobacco industry to get a new generation addicted to vaping. And I'll come back to that a bit later. So we have seen repeated moves, consistent moves in Victoria and also at the Commonwealth level, and credit is due to governments of all persuasions for advancing the cause of tobacco control. What this bill demonstrates is that our work is not complete, that the task is not over. We do know that there are a lot of Victorians who continue to smoke. Around 12%, it's estimated, smoke at some point on a regular basis, at least weekly. And we know that that's higher for certain populations. And we certainly have an obligation to do whatever we can to reduce those rates. The legislation before us today, Tobacco Amendment, Tobacco Retailer and Wholesale Licensing Scheme Bill 2024, makes a number of significant and important changes to the Tobacco Act. Most importantly and significantly, it introduces a comprehensive licensing scheme for the sale of tobacco in Victoria. Similar states, New South Wales is moving as well, have measures in place such as the one that is being put into Victoria. It will prohibit the retail and wholesale sale of tobacco products by any person without a licence, which is granted under the provisions of the Tobacco Act. It will introduce powers for the regulator to impose conditions on tobacco licensees, such as suitability requirements, to ensure that licences cannot be held by anyone who's not a fit and proper person in accordance with the requirements of the scheme. And the regulator will have broad powers to consider whether an applicant is an appropriate person to hold a licence. And that means from the commencement of those provisions, next a licensing scheme will be put in place that can accept applications from tobacco businesses, so that those who are existing businesses in the sale, involved in the retail and wholesale sale of tobacco products, will be able to make application to get a licence under that scheme that's in place. We clearly have a problem here in Victoria with the sale of illegal tobacco that criminal elements, organised crime, have seized upon the tobacco trade as a way to make money to fund other sorts of activities. And combating that illegal tobacco industry and the harm that it is bringing not only to those involved in the process, but the innocent bystanders, many of whom quite literally are sleeping unaware near the sites of these tobacco businesses that are being targeted by criminal activity and suffering the consequences. The bill will introduce new offences and strengthen penalties to ensure that Victoria has some of the strongest illicit tobacco offences in the country. It introduces inspection and enforcement powers for licensing of inspectors, including the power to enter premises for compliance monitoring and inspection and seizure powers. The regulator will also be able to issue improvement notices and accept enforceable undertakings to bring compliance with the licensing, to bring about compliance with the licensing scheme. Victoria Police will continue to be responsible for and focused on detecting and investigating serious organised crime associated with illicit tobacco, and the bill will help strengthen the police efforts to crack down on illicit tobacco by providing police officers with the ability to exercise enforcement powers under the licensing scheme, including to obtain search warrants, enter premises, seize illicit items to support the detention and enforcement of serious criminal activity. The bill will also modernise and broaden the scope of what's considered illicit tobacco to align with the Commonwealth tobacco legislation and remove barriers to enforcing illicit tobacco offences. The current legislation provides for separate illicit tobacco offences depending on whether the item is smuggled or an excisable good, which can be difficult for an inspector to determine, preventing enforcement from being undertaken. Clarity is going to help enforcement, and that's what this bill is providing for. While it is important to investigate, obviously, the supply chains for the importation of tobacco products, this expanded definition of these matters will allow enforcement agencies to act based on the packaging and product compliance without necessarily having to undertake the complex surveillance investigations to determine whether duties have been paid. There are serious offences in this bill that are backed by strong penalties, the strongest penalties in the country for those who commit them. For possession offences, which only apply to tobacco supply businesses, the penalty for a business possessing illicit tobacco is 120 penalty units for a natural person, or 600 penalty units for a body corporate. The penalty for a business possessing a commercial quantity of illicit tobacco is up to 840 penalty units and 5 years in jail, and 4,200 penalty units for a body corporate. There's serious supply offences, both a supply illicit tobacco offence and supplying a commercial quantity of illicit tobacco offences with jail terms in place as well. Mr Davis has moved an amendment on behalf of the opposition to clarify some matters with respect to the commencement dates in the legislation. In the debate in the other place, members made it clear, the government made it clear, that our intent has always been for the licensing scheme to commence from mid-next year, so mid-2025, with the enforcement of penalties for unlicensed retailers commencing in early 2026. So the amendment that Mr Davis has moved to clarify the commencement dates is consistent with the government's stated policy position and will be supported by the government. I just want to come finally to the question of vaping. It is a topic that I am particularly concerned about. It's been a topic that I have made several speeches now in this parliament, including in my inaugural speech, to highlight what I think is one of the biggest public health challenges that our state and our nation faces, and particularly that our nation's children face. That vaping has become and vaping has been used as a Trojan horse for the tobacco industry to get a new generation addicted to nicotine. Vapes are not safe. They are not a health tool. They are a tool of addiction that is using flavours and gimmicks and a less detectable smell and a less offensive smell to hook a new generation of people to the consumption of nicotine. And the great lie that's been told is that somehow vapes are a tool to help. And it's a lie that's been peddled by the tobacco industry, and some people, unfortunately, have taken the bait. Vapes aren't a tool to help. They're a tool to get addicted. They are a mechanism, a new mechanism, to supply deadly toxins into the lungs of young people. And the number of, recent study in the UK, the number of children who vape who have never smoked is skyrocketing. So the plans from Big Tobacco are working and our kids are suffering, and we have got to act to stop it. And this bill is a step in the right direction to help with that action. The Commonwealth is taking steps in the right direction. I hope they work, and if they don't, we're going to have to redouble our efforts to make sure that action continues to be taken. Just like here in Victoria, our tobacco control efforts didn't stop with the passage of the 1987 Act. Today, our commitment to ending harm from vaping can't stop with the actions that the Commonwealth has taken and this state's taken through this bill. I wholeheartedly commend it to the House.
Thank you, Mr Batchelor.